You are set to start.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program on Afghanistan as relates to OFAC and OFAC exceptions, general license exceptions for nonprofits that are seeking to operate on the ground. Let me introduce the person that's the primary mover in putting this panel together, Andrea El-Attar. Ms. El-Attar advises corporations, not-profit organizations, and individuals on compliance with U.S. economic sanctions, export controls, anti-money laundering, and anti-corruption laws and regulations. Ms. El-Attar is familiar with both licensing and enforcement processes at the U.S. Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Asset Controls, OFAC. From May 2018 to May 2019, she served as section chief in OFAC's licensing division. In this role, Ms. El-Attar was responsible for managing a team of licensing officers reviewing license applications. Managing teams of licensing officers reviewing license applications and requests for interpretive guidance received under the Iran and non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction sanctions programs. Ms. El-Attar was also previously worked at OFAC's enforcement division as an enforcement officer. In addition, her professional experience includes time spent as an associate of two global law firms, Mildank LLP and Allen Overy LLP. Ms. El-Attar is a member of the ABILS Export Controls and Economic Sanctions and International Trade Committee. She's also co-chair of the DC Bar International Law Community's International Trade Subcommittee. Andrea, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction. And thank you to the American Bar Association for hosting us today. We're very honored to have a great panel here to discuss the issues facing Afghanistan with us. I will start by introducing my co-moderator, Jonathan Meyer. Jonathan Meyer is an attorney in private practice based in Brooklyn, New York. He is vice chair of several committees of the American Bar Association International Law Section, including the Export Controls and Economic Sanctions Committee, the National Security Committee, and the International Trade Committee. And here with us today, we have a number of panelists to speak on different issues. I will introduce each of them. The first is John Boscariol. He is head of McCarthy Tétrault's International Trade and Investment Law Group and a partner in the litigation group. He helps clients understand how international trade agreements and foreign investment laws impact their business. He specializes in investigations, enforcement, disputes and compliance regarding economic sanctions, anti-corruption law and policy, export and technology transfer controls, blocking orders, government contracts, national security, anti-dumping, countervailing safeguard customs issues, tariffs, and border measures. He has developed a recognized expertise in advising on the intersection of Canadian economic sanctions, export and technology controls, and anti-corruption measures. And he has published a number of articles and has also testified before Canada's Parliament on the enforcement of economic sanctions and anti-terrorism laws. And he will be providing an overview of Canada's sanctions regime with respect to Afghanistan today. Next, we have James Brett. James is the founder of the UK and Europe's first pomegranate juice drink. He is also the founder of Plant for Peace, a strategist, grassroots climate activist, public motivational speaker, and personal trauma recovery specialist. Brett founded Plant for Peace, a social enterprise focused on bringing peace to Afghanistan through the creation of agricultural cooperatives. It is perhaps no surprise that he related to Afghanistan's people, most of whom have also lived lives characterized by poverty, conflict, and uncertainty. For over a decade, Brett has been working in Afghanistan to support a country ravaged by war and to bring meaning and purpose to his own life. He went with no bodyguard, no gun, and no limits to his ambition. Brett learned to speak Dari and built relationships across the country. He was able to set up meetings with 55,000 tribal elders to convince them to leave violence and drug production behind them. He has burned several tons of heroin. He has also imported produce from Afghanistan to sell fruit bars in the United Kingdom. His outlook on life is hard earned, but it's what is making a difference. Empathy born from experience. And he will be sharing with us today some of his personal experiences operating in Afghanistan. Next, we have Brad Brooks-Rubin. He is a strategic advisor and North America engagement lead at the Responsible Jewelry Council, the world's leading standard-setting organization for the jewelry and watch industry. Brad also serves as senior advisor at the Sentry, an investigative and policy team that follows the dirty money connected to African war criminals and transnational war profiteers, and seeks to shut those benefiting from violence out of the international financial system. Prior to the Sentry and RJC, Brad served as special advisor for conflict diamonds at the U.S. Department of State, attorney advisor in the Office of the Chief Counsel for OFAC at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, and he has also held roles at the Gemological Institute of America and 2 law firms. Begum Haydar is joining us today. She is an Afghan-Danish social entrepreneur based in Copenhagen, Denmark. She was born in Afghanistan and has lived in Denmark since 1999. She was recently in Afghanistan from March of last year until she was evacuated in August following the fall of Kabul. She is using her privilege in supporting local communities in Afghanistan through social entrepreneurship projects. She believes we all have a common responsibility for encouraging peace and helping others out of hunger. She is also the founder of Cosmic Copenhagen. We also have joining us today Suzanne Kornetsky. Jill is a Harvard-trained laboratory scientist, a Brandeis-trained social scientist, a State Department and Malakian Center graduate, fellow in Persian language and culture, and a Minson. Jill has been a subject matter expert on Afghanistan for over a decade, with 7 of those years spent independently, boots on the ground. She describes herself as a social entrepreneur, an ally of Afghanistan, a Persian Viking by blood, and a chaotic good. She is the founder of Integrity Afghanistan, a small management consultancy in Kabul, Homestead Afghanistan, a 501c3 nonprofit focused on self-reliance, food security, and women's empowerment in rural Afghanistan, and Persian Viking Minerals, Afghanistan's first mineral benefit corporation, built to harness Afghanistan's natural resource wealth as an engine for sustainable livelihoods and responsible development in country. Jill left Afghanistan on August 27th to evacuate her assistant after the Taliban visited his parents on their family farm and threatened his life twice for working with the Americans. She is returning to Kabul later this month, where her office, remaining staff, and cats are waiting to fulfill the long-term commitment she has made to working directly with and for the Afghan people. Finally, we have Oliver Krisczyk. He is a principal at GKG Law PC. Oliver is a trade law attorney who focuses on representing businesses, individuals, and nonprofit organizations with issues surrounding economic sanctions, export controls, customs, cybersecurity, transportation, data privacy, and financial regulations. In his work with tax-exempt organizations, he also provides guidance related to corporate governance, intellectual property, tax-exempt status, and employment law. And he will be kicking off the program for us today by giving an overview of UN sanctions with respect to Afghanistan. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you to the American Bar Association, everyone else on this excellent panel. I'm going to be talking today a little bit about the United Nations sanctions as they relate to Afghanistan and the Taliban. As a general matter, it's important to understand that the United Nations sanctions apply to states, not necessarily to individual actors or to entities, although individuals and entities can be listed. And the UN sanctions require states to take certain actions to implement measures that are set forth in resolutions coming out of the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Security Council has issued a lot of resolutions with respect to Afghanistan and the Taliban over more than 20 years. So we're going to be going through some of the highlights to provide some context for where we are now. Starting back in 1999, Security Council Resolution 1267 decided that all member states should impose the following sanctions on the Taliban. First, denying permission for aircraft to take off or land if the aircraft is owned, leased, or operated by the Taliban. And second, an asset freeze on the Taliban, which included prohibiting making funds available to or for the benefit of the Taliban, except as may be authorized on a case-by-case basis by a designated committee for humanitarian need. In 2001, in Resolution 1363, they established a monitoring team or a monitoring group of experts to monitor the implementation of sanctions against the Taliban and provide updates and reports to the committee and to the Security Council. In 2002, in Resolution 1390, they actually grouped the sanctions against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban together into really one program. And they expanded the sanctions to include a broad asset freeze with broader language, to include a travel ban for Taliban-associated individuals and members of Taliban-associated entities and groups, among others, and an arms embargo as well, prohibiting the transfer of military goods and services and training to Taliban-associated individuals and groups. In Resolution 1452, later that year in 2002, they established humanitarian exemptions to the asset freeze. And these are really the same basic humanitarian exemptions that were used for many, many years. It includes first, an exemption for assets that were needed for basic expenses, food, housing, medical services and goods, taxes, legal services, after a notice is provided to the United Nations Committee, and there's no objection after 48 hours. Then there was also an exemption for assets for extraordinary expenses, provided that a state approves of it and then notifies the UN committee, and then the UN committee would approve of it. These exemptions had very broad language. The way that they were written includes things such as payments for foodstuffs, payments for rent or mortgage, and a number of other items on that list. In Security Council Resolution 1988, which came out in 2011, they established a separate sanctions regime for Afghanistan and the Taliban, separate from the regime that they had for Al-Qaeda. And under this new Taliban-specific sanctions regime, they imposed the following sanctions on the Taliban and associated individuals and groups: an asset freeze on all financial and economic resources of the Taliban and prohibiting making any of those available to the Taliban or associated persons directly or indirectly; two, preventing entry or exit into and out of countries of persons associated with the Taliban, except on a case-by-case basis for efforts toward reconciliation; and then third, the arms embargo. They also decided that an individual, entity, or organization can be designated as being a Taliban-related party if they participate in the financing, planning, facilitating, preparing, or perpetrating of acts or activities on behalf of or as part of the Taliban. It also included individuals and groups that supply, sell, or transfer arms and related material to the Taliban, or recruiting for the Taliban, or otherwise supporting the Taliban's actions. And it set up two new sanctions lists, one for individuals associated with the Taliban and one for groups and entities. And it cited back to those humanitarian exemptions that we talked about a moment ago. In 2012 and 2014, in resolutions 2082 and 2160, they relaxed the travel ban a little bit for reconciliation-related travel. And in 2015, in resolution 2255, they decided to continue the sanctions on the Taliban. Jumping ahead several years, in resolution 2593, which came out on August 31st, 2021, right after the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. The UN Security Council called on strengthened efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, including calling on all parties to allow UN agencies and partners and other humanitarian actors access to persons in need of assistance, and calling on all donors and international humanitarian actors to provide humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan and major Afghan refugee hosting countries. Later last year, on the 17th of September, Resolution 2596 again recognized the need for strengthened efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. On the 17th of December, in Resolution 2611, they decided to continue the sanctions against the Taliban. They extended the mandate of the monitoring team, which has still been in place all these years later. And they directed the monitoring team to gather information on instances of non-compliance with the Taliban sanctions. This is kind of a longstanding duty of the monitoring team, but I'm sure this may come up later during the panel. And then on December 22nd, 2021, in Resolution 2615, there was a very important resolution that decided that humanitarian assistance and other activities that support basic human needs in Afghanistan are not a violation of the asset freeze sanctions, which are still in place. They used very broad language. They decided that processing fund transfers and other financial transactions to ensure timely delivery of or otherwise to support humanitarian services are permitted. They strongly encouraged members to implement measures to minimize the accrual of benefits to the Taliban while taking these exemptions into account and implementing those. And they decided to review their implementation of this humanitarian exemption after 1 year. They're receiving updates every 6 months on the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, but also on the payment or diversion of funds to sanctioned parties. And so this is the primary humanitarian exemption at the UN level that then trickled down to a number of different states, which took corresponding action, which or did not, which we will talk about here next. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Oliver. That was very helpful. We are now going to have an overview of US sanctions with respect to Afghanistan. Unfortunately, Coleman Griffin was unable to join us today, so I'll be providing that overview. And just one moment while I pull up those slides. Okay, so So just a quick disclaimer before I launch into the substance of the program. The views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not reflect the official policy or views of the Treasury Department or the US government. In addition, this presentation is provided for general information purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Following the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban in August of last year, a number of questions were raised by organizations, both commercial and nonprofit, regarding the types of activities that would be permissible with respect to Afghanistan under US sanctions. This is because the Taliban is a specially designated global terrorist, and the Haqqani network is both a specially designated global terrorist and a foreign terrorist organization. OFAC responded over the course of last year by issuing a total of 6 general licenses, as well as a number of frequently asked questions, responding to concerns raised by the NGO community, and also addressing issues that were frequently coming up with respect to humanitarian assistance, relief activities, and other activities. In September of 2021, we had General License 14 authorizing certain humanitarian activities in Afghanistan by organizations specified in the General License. We also had General License 15, which is an AgMed General License authorizing transactions related to the exportation, re-exportation or transfer of commodities, medicine, medical devices, and software updates of medical devices in Afghanistan. And we had General License 16 then in December of 2021, which authorizes non-commercial personal remittances to Afghanistan. In later December of 2021, we had 3 additional general licenses, as well as a fact sheet that was issued by OFAC on the provision of humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan and support for the Afghan people. These additional general licenses were in part to implement the United States obligations under UN Security Council Resolution 2615, responding to basic needs of the people in Afghanistan. We had General License 17 authorizing official business of the US government, 18 authorizing official activities of certain international organizations and other international entities, and 19 authorizing certain transactions and support of NGOs' activities in Afghanistan. Then in January and February of this year, senior level Treasury officials had meetings with representatives from NGOs responding to their concerns about the ability to engage in humanitarian activities. And Treasury responded by issuing a number of additional FAQs, clarifying the types of activities that would be authorized. As you can see, these general licenses were issued in a piecemeal fashion, and there's quite a bit of overlap between them. But a number of the issues have now been addressed by the broader General License 20 that was issued on February 25th of this year. And we'll delve into a little bit about what General License 20 covers. We'll discuss it at a high level because I want to leave time for us to engage with discussion with all the panelists. But General License 20 authorizes transactions with the Taliban and the Haqqani network that would otherwise be prohibited by US sanctions laws with certain limitations. Specifically, General License 20 authorizes, to the extent authorization is required, all transactions involving Afghanistan or governing institutions in Afghanistan that are prohibited by the global terrorism sanctions regulations, the Foreign Terrorist Organizations sanctions regulations, or Executive Order 13224. Some of the limitations on the general license include, most importantly, that the general license does not authorize financial transfers to the Taliban, the Haqqani network, associated entities, or blocked individuals who are in leadership positions at governing institutions in Afghanistan, unless the transfer is for the purpose of effecting the payment of taxes, fees, or import duties, or the purchase or receipt of permits, licenses, or public utility services. In addition, these financial transfers cannot be related to luxury items or services. So payments of taxes, fees, or import duties, payments for the purchase or receipt of permits, licenses, or public utility services that are authorized, those cannot relate to luxury items or services. In addition, the general license does not authorize the transfer of luxury items or services to the Taliban, Haqqani network, or associated entities, or blocked individuals who are in leadership positions at governing institutions in Afghanistan. OFAC has issued an FAQ giving examples of some of the types of transactions that are authorized by General License 20. These include commercial transactions involving Afghanistan, dealings with governing ministries and institutions, as well as state-owned or controlled companies in Afghanistan. Also, the processing of payments, including transfers involving privately owned and state-owned Afghan banks, activities related to infrastructure maintenance or development are authorized, as are activities related to the development, maintenance, and operation of civilian transportation, and incidental contact with the Taliban or Haqqani network or blocked individuals who are in leadership roles in governing institutions in Afghanistan are also authorized if they're in connection with an activity that is captured with within the terms of one of OFAC's general licenses. And OFAC has issued a number of frequently asked questions providing guidance on how to conduct due diligence to determine whether a transaction might involve a member of the Taliban or the Haqqani network, as well as the types of incidental contact with members of the Taliban and Haqqani network that would be considered ordinarily incident and necessary to engaging in authorized activities. With respect to due diligence, OFAC points to its SDN search list tool, which is available on OFAC's website. A number of members of the Taliban and Haqqani network are identified on the SDN list. However, these SDN searches need to be supplemented by additional due diligence. This is because while OFAC lists a number of entities that are 50% or more owned by the Taliban or Haqqani network on its SDN list, not all of these types of entities are always captured on the SDN list. So additional diligence is needed to determine if you could potentially have a member of the Taliban or Haqqani network that you're engaged in transactions with. And OFAC encourages organizations operating in Afghanistan to use all information at their disposal to conduct comprehensive due diligence on counterparties involved in their transactions. FAQ 958 lists out some examples of transactions that would be considered ordinarily an incident and necessary to engaging in transactions authorized under general licenses issued by OFAC with respect to Afghanistan that involve the Taliban and or Haqqani network. And some of these types of authorized incidental contact include general coordination on delivery and provision of humanitarian aid shipments, administrative issues on importation of goods, attendance at donor coordination meetings, participation in technical working groups, among other activities. In addition, OFAC has issued guidance on the types of activities that are authorized when a blocked individual holds a leadership position at a governing institution in Afghanistan. OFAC has clarified that the mere fact that a blocked individual holds a leadership position does not make the governing institution itself a blocked entity. Some of the types of activities that would be authorized when dealing with a governing institution that has a blocked individual as a leader include customs payments to those governing institutions, signing a contract where a blocked individual is also signing the contract in his or her capacity as a leader of a governing institution, as well as the payment of taxes, fees, or import duties, or the purchase of permits, licensing, or public utility services to blocked individuals that are in leadership roles at these institutions, provided that such payments do not relate to luxury items or services. In addition, in contrast, rather, if the blocked individual were to request that the payments be made directly to the individual, not in his or her capacity as the leader of the governing institution, then those payments would be prohibited and not within the terms of the general license. And then OFAC has also issued guidance on what constitutes luxury items or services for purposes of General License 20. And it points back to the concept of basic needs. So if an item is not in support of a basic need, then it would be considered a luxury item or service. And some of the examples of luxury items that are provided in the FAQ include yachts, furs, designer clothing, as well as certain entertainment services. If a transaction doesn't fall within the scope of a general license, you can apply for a specific license using OFAC's online specific license application tool. And OFAC gives some guidance on things to include in your application. It's very important to include a detailed description of the transactions in which you would like to engage, as well as an overview of why you think they are prohibited by US sanctions laws, and any policy arguments that you have in support of why the license should be granted. And then I will just touch briefly on a few compliance resources that OFAC has, as it will be relevant for part of our discussion. OFAC issued a framework for compliance commitments in May of 2019. And this framework outlines some of the factors that a company should consider when developing its sanctions compliance program, as well as the essential elements or components of any compliance program. OFAC also has a risk matrix that it's published for the charitable sector and helping entities in this sector to think through some of the risks that may be present in their activities from a sanctions perspective. And they've also issued guidance noting that the agency will prioritize requests for licenses to provide humanitarian assistance, and will try to review those requests expeditiously. And then lastly, apart from the formal license application process, OFAC also maintains a feedback email inbox as well as hotline, and I've listed that email address as well as the phone numbers where individuals with questions can seek informal guidance from OFAC on the scope of US sanctions authorities. So I will now turn it back to Jonathan for the discussion portion of our program. Sorry, let me just end sharing.
Andrea, can you hear me now? Yes.
I can.
Great. So shall I start with a question portion of our program? Is that good?
Sure.
Great. I have a question. It's a general question, and it's, how have you seen the situation in Afghanistan change since the Taliban came back into power? If any of our panelists would like to opine, Jill or anyone, it would be a great opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, so hi, thank you for having me. Obviously, everyone's really well aware of the problematic sides of the Taliban takeover, the food crisis, the cash crisis. On the other side, and sort of related to sanctions and due diligence, we're seeing a lot of activity to control the flows of aid and to control the money that's going in. While some of these are hampering things and making them difficult, they're things that maybe should have been in place for a long time. We're finally tracking where the money is going. We're finally tracking who's ending up with it. And those probably should have been in place this entire time. So those are the sort of overarching changes that I think we're seeing.
That poses a second question to our panelists, and that's, since the Taliban came to power, what are the largest concerns? First, the Afghani people, and second, for the organizations working in Afghanistan. Anyone would like to address that issue, including yourself, Jill, since you are boots on the ground for quite some time?
Sure, I think Gul can also offer some insights into this. The food crisis and the cash crisis are ongoing problems. I think one common misperception is that the food and cash crises were perpetuated by the freezing of funds. I don't particularly agree with that. I think the bigger problem is the overnight loss of over 1 million jobs. So people who were already living marginally without savings suddenly find themselves without employment. So that is the biggest problem that I see. There's obviously gender restrictions, there's restrictions on rights for women, and there's certainly restrictions on rights for minorities and potential threats against both women and minorities. So I think those are the biggest ones. Cool. Can you think of others that I'm overlooking?
Thank you, Jill, and thank you for the question. In addition to what Jill just mentioned, local people in Afghanistan, they are so desperate to move out of the country, not only because they have worked for the previous government, but also people who have no hope for themselves, for their children, and not only the girl child, but also the boy child, because they're afraid that they might join the battlefield in the future, since the weather is getting better. So there might come a civil war in Afghanistan. So people are quite afraid of that. So right now, people are trying to survive, and they have no hope to build a future in Afghanistan. And apart from that, young people, they are quite traumatized. They want to find a way to move any country as long as it's not in Afghanistan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have problems with my microphone. I have a third question, and this is going to be directed to John, Andrea, and Oliver. Are the authorizations provided by the U.S. and other governments sufficient for the humanitarian activities in which organizations are seeking to engage? As stated, that's for John, Andrea, and / Oliver.
Jonathan, this might be a good opportunity to turn back over for John to explain some of the distinctions between the US and Canadian regime, because I understand that this is a major concern in Canada.
Great, that's fine.
Yeah, and Andrea, if it's okay, I can go through my slides quickly. I think we jumped ahead a bit there. I was going to cover off the Canadian position, and I think I'll answer that question when I do that. Can you guys see my slides there on the screen?
Yes.
Yeah, so just very quickly, I want to take 10 minutes to describe the situation in Canada. Right now, technically, Afghanistan's not a country that's sanctioned by Canada per se. If you look on our website, on the Global Affairs Canada website, which lists sanctioned countries, you won't see Afghanistan there. However, as a practical matter, we are treating Afghanistan as if it is a sanctioned country for a couple of reasons. First, we do have sanctions against the Taliban under our United Nations Act. So Oliver went through very, very nicely and succinctly the measures that the UN has put in place. Canada has adopted those measures, brought them into its domestic law under the United Nations Act. And so to the extent that the UN requires us to impose sanctions against the parties, both the entities and individuals that the United Nations Act has directed us to, we've implemented that under our regulations under the United Nations Act. The second part of our sanctions program is a lot more challenging, and that's what I was going to get into a bit today, and that is the designation of the Taliban as a terrorist entity, essentially a terrorist group for purposes of our criminal code, which is entirely separate from what the United Nations has done, and that's what's causing difficulty now in Canada. So for those of you who have joined, and I know there's some joining from Canada as well as in the United States and other locations, a quick note here to really get down to whether these sanctions are going to be relevant to you or not. So first, on jurisdiction, Canadian sanctions apply to persons in Canada and Canadians outside Canada. So if you're operating in Canada, so this is the territorial element of it, you're operating through a branch, or maybe you're doing something with a Canadian relief organization and you are considered to be in Canada. In those circumstances, what I'm about to describe will apply to you. Secondly, if you're a Canadian whether you're a Canadian organization or you're a Canadian national working for a foreign relief organization or nonprofit, you will be subject to these rules as well. So they apply to your activities anywhere in the world if you are Canadian organized or if you are a citizen of Canada and working for a foreign entity. Our sanctions are administered primarily by Global Affairs Canada, and permits and certificates, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment, are issued by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. We also have sanctions, as I mentioned, against terrorist entities. That's the second part of this. That's administered by Public Safety Canada, and authorizations for that activity are issued by the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. Quick note on a bit of a difference between sanctions programs in Canada and the United States. There are a few really relevant ones, but certainly in Canada, sanctions breaches are all criminal offenses. That means they require demonstration of knowledge and intent, kind of mens rea. We don't have strict liability like you do in the United States, so that sometimes makes a difference in assessing some of these situations. Our sanctions on the enforcement side, they're enforced by our federal police force, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They investigate, and if they determine that there is a sanctions violation, in order for you to be penalized for that, you'd actually have to be convicted after a trial or pleading guilty to that, and then you would receive a penalty as a result of that. So slightly different approach here in Canada. We don't have civil penalties, and as I say, it's not a strict liability prohibition. I don't want to spend too much time on our UN sanctions here, because I think Oliver covered it quite nicely. We're incorporating all of that here into our sanctions in Canada. Oliver, and I think Andrea also mentioned United States Security Council Resolution 2615, which I think that's the one that made it clear that humanitarian assistance is not a violation of the asset freezes that are in place. Unfortunately, on the Canadian side, we do not have general licenses. There is an ability to issue general permits, but our government hasn't done that. So all those general licenses that Andrea described on the US side, we look at that quite jealously from the Canadian side. We don't have that. And so if you're going to engage in any activities involving the Taliban or these individuals or entities that are listed pursuant to the UN sanctions, you need to still get a certificate from the Canadian government confirming that indeed the activity you're engaged in was not intended to be covered by the UN sanctions. There's a process for doing that. We've gone through that a few times on the Canadian side, a bit cumbersome, but unfortunately there's no general license, there's no general exemption here in Canada for humanitarian or nonprofit or NGO activities in Afghanistan. You're going to have to interact with the Canadian government, unfortunately, to actually engage in any of these activities. The challenging one really right now for Canadian NGOs and charitable organizations, and we're advising a number of them on this, is the criminal code listing of the Taliban as what we call a listed entity, effectively a terrorist group. There are two provisions in our criminal code that limit what you can and can't do with these, mostly what you can't do, I should say, with these organizations. One is the traditional asset freeze that's already been described, and that's under Section 8308 of our criminal code. There is an ability to get a license or authorization to engage in those activities. That would come from Canada's Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. You'd go through Public Safety Canada and you'd apply for an authorization to be able to deal with organizations that are run by the Taliban. Or individuals that might be part of the Taliban as part of your work either in or with Afghanistan. Unfortunately, there's another provision in our criminal code under 83.03, which prohibits directly or indirectly providing or making available property or financial or related services, knowing that those in whole or in part will be used to benefit a terrorist group, i.e. the Taliban. That is the big question mark right now that a lot of organizations are trying to deal with here in Canada. And unfortunately, there's no provision in our criminal code that allows our minister to issue an authorization for that. So we've been in discussions with Global Affairs Canada, Public Safety Canada, the RCMP. We understand a number of organizations within the Canadian government are trying to figure this issue out. There's still, to our knowledge, hasn't been a solution to that. So it's definitely a challenge that I think any nonprofit doing work in or with Afghanistan is going to have to deal with if you have those jurisdictional connections to Canada that I mentioned earlier on. Just jumping ahead here to finish this off, most obviously, I think it is a different compliance regime here in Canada. We have no guidance for nonprofits or NGOs that are seeking to provide humanitarian assistance in Canada. As I said, there's no general licenses that have been issued. What this really means is you're going to have to coordinate quite closely with the Canadian government for your activities in Afghanistan. And as I mentioned before, that includes Public Safety Canada, the RCMP, Global Affairs Canada, the minister's offices as well, Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Public Safety, in order to engage in this. And then one final point I would make on that is your banking partners. Canadian banks are also subject to these measures. So if you have your bank account at Canadian banks, you're getting financing for some of the transactions for providing humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan from Canadian banks, they too will be pushing you on this. They are subject to these restrictions as well. And there will need to be, as part of your approach to the Canadian government on this and dealing with the proper authorities here in the Canadian government, you will need to involve your banking institution as well, to the extent that you're getting financial services or funding either from or through a Canadian financial institution. So let me leave it at that. I'm going to stop my sharing here. And I think I answered your question too, Jonathan,
Yes,
hopefully, but
listen,
I wanted to make sure we
apologies.
got in the Canadian piece as
My
well.
apologies to you, John. When Andrea said Jonathan, I think sometimes he will inadvertently say John or Jonathan. We're interchangeable. So when she said Jonathan, I thought she was asking me to introduce some of the questions. That was a great presentation. May I ask one more pursuant to that presentation? And it's to you, John, and others in the audience. Are payments flowing to and from Afghanistan easy? Why or why not? And what are, and that by, and again,
Well, I'll
have,
answer for, yeah, sorry, Jonathan, I'll answer for Canada, and then I'm sure others will have some thoughts on that. Right now, I'd say extremely challenging processing those payments. If they're going through a bank or other financial service provider in Canada, they will be scrutinizing those payments very carefully to see if there's any involvement of the Afghanistan government or a Taliban organization to make that connection to the Taliban. So it's going to be a heavy load on the due diligence side for NGOs that are going to be using the Canadian financial system for that assistance.
Thank you, John. And Andrea, may I ask if you can apply, Oliver, would you like to respond to that as well as Andrea? My apologies, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I had one follow-up question for you though, John, based on your presentation. You outlined a lot of steps that are needed to coordinate closely with the government in Canada if you are going to engage in humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan. How feasible is that? I mean, how realistic is that? I imagine for some bigger organizations, they may have the resources to do it, but is it something that can be done, or is there additional relief that's really needed to allow organizations to participate in humanitarian assistance?
This is a great question, Oliver, because for years, even before we're dealing with the latest chaos, I describe it, with the Russia sanctions, for years we've been asking the Canadian government to provide something more similar to what you see in the UK, in the EU, and the United States when it comes to guidance and when it comes to responding to questions and concerns, when it comes to processing permit applications and other authorizations. The Canadian government has been very aggressive in passing very aggressive sanctions measures, like listing the Taliban as a terrorist entity independent from the UN sanctions, like having very aggressive measures when it comes to other countries and sanctions programs that apply to them. Unfortunately, they haven't kept up with the infrastructure. They haven't built the infrastructure within Global Affairs Canada to properly deal with questions and concerns that come up. And as a result, I do think it's very much more challenging now for smaller NGOs and charitable organizations that want to, from their base in Canada, that want to now provide assistance in Afghanistan. I can tell you that the government does respond more quickly with humanitarian organizations than with for-profit organizations. That's been our experience, and because the government does want to facilitate this, but they haven't yet, to my knowledge, or at least they haven't publicly announced a solution to the problem we have right now, which is the Taliban being a listed entity, and essentially most organizations who are doing, who are conducting activities in Afghanistan are going to have some interaction with the government. And how does the Canadian government deal with that? If that interaction involves a payment of fees, payment of taxes, some kind of dealing that you're engaged in, which would be prohibited if because they're a terrorist entity. That guidance hasn't been released. So on the one hand, I'd say it's not a great circumstance because we don't have that guidance. On the other hand, if you do reach out to the Canadian government, my experience is, whether you do it directly or through your council, they will respond more quickly if there is a true humanitarian concern at the heart of this.
Thanks, John. I think on the US side, from what we've seen, certainly before, I think, General License 20, we were seeing a lot of difficulty with payments, and it may not have been actual difficulty in getting it implemented. There might have been a fear factor as well. I think companies in the US, including nonprofits, are conscious about not wanting to jeopardize their relationships with banks. And it can be tough to deal with financial institutions sometimes, and you want to make sure you have a good relationship with them and all these sorts of things. And so certainly what we saw, I think, prior to General License 20, but after the Taliban took over large parts of Afghanistan, was a lot of nonprofits taking a step back and kind of watching and waiting to see what would happen. I think the new General License 20 on paper, it seems very, very broad in a promising way, but at least when we look at general licenses and are advising, I mean, we kind of try to transform a general license into a set of check boxes that we can go through. And so even with General License 20, there are questions about luxury items or otherwise, how that's going to come in, and whether the purpose for payments, including taxes, fees, import duties, et cetera, to accounts that are controlled by the Taliban, whether there are cases where you might need to engage in a transfer that are not included on that list. And so these are kind of some open questions. And I think we're still waiting to see if General License 20 was enough. I'm sure that the other panelists who have been more active on the ground or with organizations that are on the ground over there might have some more insight into how money is moving, and then whether General License 20 is enough or whether more is needed.
I can speak from the American side in terms of payments for rent and services like internet and salaries and stipends for food. Comfort letters have been issued to American banks, but American banks in general don't traffic in international wires particularly often. So it's already a bit of a strange transaction for them to begin with, and they're very cautious. So I've been using Western Union. All transactions up to 400 are still available, and that seems to cover salaries and small office expenses. A lot of people are working on workarounds. Some people are using Hawala, which I don't personally use and I don't advocate using, just because the one Hawala system I know in Afghanistan flows through the Haqqani network. So that's an issue. Western Union works. A lot of landlords, a lot of internet providers actually have offices in Turkey and Dubai. So a lot of them will accept payments in those alternative countries for services in Afghanistan. There was a few times when Western Union was not working properly, and I tried to send $300 to the bank, and it was held up for 3 weeks and then denied and sent back to me. So there's still certainly a lot of work to be done on transactions there. I don't know if James has experience from the UK side in sending support to your staff in country.
Yeah, very much so. Pre-Taliban takeover, transactions were, if successful, were taken from the UK around about 35 days. You know, that's a long time for the Afghans. You know, it was forced, in a way, it was forcing us to use cash, which is, you know, it's crazy that the, you know, the situation forces you to use something that the situation is trying to avoid. You know, so, you know, in the end, as you say, Western Union, we, you know, with minimal amounts can be taken to Afghanistan. We were buying containers of, you know, 20-foot containers full of mulberries, all sieved and sorted by female Afghan staff, which was, you know, great to see and everything. And the whole operation was hindered by financial paper trails and financial activity. You know, it's very difficult to explain that to people. I'm sure you know that yourself. It's very difficult to explain to people on the ground. You know, they're only interested in one thing, and that's feeding their families. That there's a delay in an operation due to you know, financial transactions when the money's there. You know, the money's physically there, but you just can't get it to where it needs to go. Very difficult.
Yeah, and in terms of paying taxes in Afghanistan, the online system that had been operating under JIROA is offline. You cannot, you can no longer either register no income or pay your taxes there. So it's going to be in cash anyway at an office with a physical receipt, which in some ways is better. There's also some alternative solutions. There's a charity called Binance that is supporting females, the Afghan robotics team, and a few other female staffed NGO type activities. They're transferring those stipends in Bitcoin, and a local office has opened up to transfer that Bitcoin into cash. And I don't know fully the mechanism, but it's not full Bitcoin, it's stabilized to the dollar or something so that there's some consistency and it's not the big ups and downs you get with crypto.
Yeah. Also, since Taliban takeover, the regulator of banks themselves in the UK have really gone sort of hard line on the actual banks, to the extent that, you know, my own organisation, Plant for Peace, we're not allowed to do any transactions now to Afghanistan. We're under an audit from the banks, you know, which is no problem for us. It's just delays everything. But we wouldn't try now to send money to Afghanistan anyway, not in the current climate. You know, I think a key, you know, one of the sort of main things that comes from this whole situation is that so much activity is now, you know, disabled or on hold due to the current situation, where actually circumventing the Taliban themselves. You know, they would, you know, they would be in agreement to be circumvented if it meant that people on the ground could get on some of the activities that are needed. You know, they're desperate in their own right. You know, the current leadership, they're desperate in their own right. All they want is acceptance, and it's so difficult to offer them that when you look at the amount of people on the you know, on the sort of bad boy list. Excuse my terminology. You know, where you know, we need to overcome all these problems because, you know, there's approximately 40 million Afghan people that are you know, being blockaded because of who's you know, so say leading the country. We've got to find a way to get around these things. You know, it's ridiculous.
Begum.
We have a project in Afghanistan, you know, approved for $2.6 billion funding. It's not a small amount of money. It's not a small project. And we're only waiting now for this whole situation. We, you know, the UN who worked with us to approve the strategy is also just waiting. UNCCD, they're just waiting for the dust to settle because they can't access any pledges of funding to deliver this program. You know, it's a devastating situation for the people on the ground. You know, I speak to my team every day in Afghanistan, every single day. You know, since the Taliban took over, we had to go through the whole process of approval. You know, Ministry of Agriculture, Presidential Palace. You know, we're you know, our Afghan team are having to deal, you know, with you know, Deputy Prime Minister and the current acting ministers. All you know, they'd have never dreamt. You know, the country director of Plant for Peace has only been, from the day he was born, has been brought up in war. He doesn't know stability. He doesn't know peace. And you know, he'd walk to school with you know, he showed me pictures where he'd go to school and the lamppost, people were hanging on either side of every lamppost all down the streets to school. You know, horrendous situation. And we come to a point where, you know, he's worked for 15 years on this project, and it's blocked now because the current leadership's in place, and the financial situation of these sanctions is you know, crippling the people on the ground. It's a difficult situation for everyone involved.
May I interject with another question on the same line that we've been discussing? Do you have, and that includes John and Oliver and we're involved and Jill, do you have any best practices suggestions or advice for working with financial institutions with respect to Afghanistan and related transactions? And then I want to follow up with one second question for you, Jill, and others that may have been on the ground is, what kind of due diligence can be conducted to vet the individuals we're dealing with to see if they're members of the Taliban or the Haqqani network? First question, please. Thank you to anyone that would like to answer.
I can speak to it a little bit. I mean, in terms of dealing with financial institutions, you know, in the U.S., if you're a U.S. company, let's say, it's tough, and it really depends on what your relationship is with your financial institution. I mean, if you are primarily using maybe platforms like PayPal, where you don't really have the type of face-to-face relationship, then that might dictate, you know, how you're going to proceed there. On the other hand, if you have a face-to-face relationship, you may want to be in a position where you can provide supporting documentation fairly quickly or ahead of time as to projects that you're going to be involved in. And, you know, even if they're not going to screen them for compliance purposes right away, they can have them on hand if anything comes up, or if there's some type of red flag in the wire department or something like that. But it really depends, kind of organization to organization, what your financial institution is doing. If you have accounts at a foreign financial institution, you know, through a chapter or an affiliate, that may be different as well. And we try to take a tailored approach based on the organization and the banks that they're working with.
Brad,
Sorry, go ahead.
it looks like you have your hand raised with some insights to share on this issue.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I think I'm happy to go after Jill or anybody else who's working directly. I was going to sort of bring in context from other situations since I have less in Afghanistan directly. Or I'm happy to go ahead, whichever's better.
No, go for it.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, look, I think I think there's been a lot of good advice, and certainly those last comments, especially because I think there's a few levels at which I think it's important to think through this kind of due diligence and engagement. And there is the level at which you have to deal with your bank, and you know, the advice or the comments just given were good. I think the second level is the public level, and to some extent that you know, it relates to banks but can sort of be separate, which is for any, you know, organization, and especially you know, working at the Responsible Jewelry Council, we have a number of companies members who are, you know, who had been connected or might have been interested in engaging in the Afghan either gems or metals sectors. It's very challenging to figure out how to conduct both the due diligence to determine whether or not you, as a company itself, feels comfortable that it's dealing with the right people, and the investment would be of the kind that would support the Afghan people and Afghan communities. And then the second part is, how will that be viewed by external stakeholders? And I think there is so my experience comes largely from sub-Saharan Africa and a range of countries where there were versions of these kinds of sanctions in place, as well as quite a lot of concern about the role of various armed groups and the military and their roles in, the gem or mineral sectors in one place or another. And often what we have seen is companies, sort of taking the position that A, they don't want to be involved, or B, if they are involved, they want to be, really kind of on the down low. And I think over time, what we've seen is something of a shift, although I think it's still very much in process, which is there is some benefit to companies being and traders, and I think the same applies to NGOs in a different way, with being public about what that due diligence looks like, and what you've conducted and who you've engaged. And obviously security and other, I'm not talking about naming names if we talk to this person and that person in a way that a bank might need, but a bit more generally, because I think there is often there's a lot of discussion about what the sanctions do and don't require. And then there's the broader level of kind of de-risking and over-compliance that we run into. And in some cases, what we've seen in other contexts in sub-Saharan Africa is that being public about that can actually be useful, because it provides a level of engagement and a level of sort of discourse about what is clearly a very challenging subject and set of issues. There's no easy answer, there's no good answer, but the various points you've just heard, and especially around the Plan for Peace project, et cetera, the one of the ways I think that we can be helping to solve this problem, or not solve, but helping to contribute to ways forward, is by enabling a level of, in some ways, public discourse that defines what due diligence looks like and defines what reasonable business looks like or responsible business looks like. And that can perhaps over time also be something that banks start to look at when they think about what makes them comfortable. I mean, banks are always thinking about whether or not OFAC will penalize them. But even once they've gotten past the idea of being penalized, there is the broader, are we going to be facing other levels of scrutiny or public concern about this? And so I would put out there that experience from other contexts indicates that it may be useful to think about that, again, taking into full account security and context. And this isn't something that changes overnight, but I think it is a direction that would be helpful to consider. So let me just stop there.
Andrea, would you like to take over with the next question, my dear? Are you on, or would you like to address the issue?
I'm on. I think Jill had some points she wanted to raise, and then we'll maybe go on to some of the other issues.
And if Jill also, my dear, if you can address the second question in the 2-question sequence, and that concerns due diligence. I mean, you are on the ground in Afghanistan. You have hands-on experience. So how can one recognize on a person-to-person basis those that may be members of the Taliban and the Haqqani network in order to exercise that due diligence? Especially, there's strict liability, as we know, with OFAC sanctions, but in terms of liability, but in terms of mitigating factors, that might be of a lot of help to the people in the audience that are listening. That's it for now. Thank you. Thank you, Andrea.
Sure. In terms of due diligence and in terms of keeping track of what you're doing, the best advice I can give in comparison to the way a lot of things have been run over the last 20 years is do it slower, do it smarter, and do it smaller. People are always trying to get these huge organizations built up with all these people and these connections, and that it's less about effectiveness and more about ego. And I think we need to let that go and start focusing more on what works. Minimum number of staff you need to do the things, increase your beneficiaries, decrease your number of people in-house. And then by doing it slower and smaller, you can truly know the people who work for you. In terms of how do you identify a Talib or someone in the Haqqani network, I hear a lot on LinkedIn that, especially former soldiers, oh, they can identify them on sight because of the eyeliner or because of the turban or because of the clothing. And if you believe that, you're fooling yourself. I've been there for 7 years. I cannot identify a Taliban site. I can have a hint, but I always turn to my local staff, and not the local staff that grew up abroad and spoke 2 languages and they spend minimal time out in the villages. Hire staff that don't speak English. Hire people who lived side by side with a lot of these people their whole life. And they can tell by their mannerisms and a combination of factors who these people are. But yeah, if you have a small organization, I don't think you have as many of these questions to ask yourself about, can I trust these people? You can trust a lot of people with your life, but trusting them with your finances in Afghanistan is a different animal completely. So I also think Oliver had something he wanted to say.
Oh, thanks, Jill. I was just going to add on to what Brad was saying previously, just really quickly to clarify that, he was talking about the reasonableness of due diligence, and the reason that's so important, at least under the U.S. regime, is it's a strict liability regime. So you can be in violation even if there was no intent or no knowledge. And so it really comes down to what due diligence you're performing, but there's no written clear standard as to what that means. Banks have developed some better standards for themselves, but that required a lot of work amongst themselves and with their associations, and working closely with OFAC to do so. And so there is really a need. I agree with Brad for nonprofits to work on coming up with industry standards as to what is reasonable in terms of due diligence when you're active on the ground. Because if that standard can be accepted, not just among the NGO not-for-profit community, but then be accepted by banks and then be accepted by the government, and everyone can kind of get on the same page. But otherwise, you can really go down the rabbit hole trying to decide, what is sufficient due diligence.
Thank you. These are all really helpful insights on the due diligence process. And we've touched a bit about a number of the challenges of operating in Afghanistan, with financial transfers, with needing to adapt to a new, with new people in place at governing institutions, just the reality of growing up in a country where there's not been stability or a sense of security for so many years. But for those of you who have been in Afghanistan, what are some of the other challenges and risks that you see organizations operating in Afghanistan face?
So for me, I see a lot of enthusiasm coming before good sense. So Afghanistan historically, and especially now, has been a place of scarcity and poverty. So scarcity and poverty combined with contracting culture didn't lead to very good behaviors. It didn't lead to a lot of honesty. It didn't lead to people behaving properly. There's a lot of Afghan saviors out there these days. I think a lot of those people raise a lot of red flags. I think we need to be really critical about why we're working with people and who we're working with. Somebody who says, oh, I used to be a minister and I have these connections. That's a red flag. That's not a positive. I used to work in this department, or I used to do this, or there's a real sense of entitlement about the money and who deserves it and where's it going to go. And we need to sort of back up a little bit and start being more about outcomes than about those sorts of connections. There's a lot of issues with theft and loss, even small things, which is one of the reasons why I think a smaller office is bigger than a big office, or better than a big office. There's been a sense of all foreign money is free money. So if you can take it, take it. It's not bad, it's just strategic. There's a sense that every single foreigner is a millionaire, and people operate off of that assumption, and it changes their behavior. It affects their behavior. So, I sort of say Afghans sometimes need a big sister to say, you can't get away with that, and that's not a good idea. And, you need to question that. So I don't know if Gul or James has something to add on that line.
I completely agree with Jill. Yes, people think that you're a millionaire. I mean, even though I'm Afghan Danish, so when I go to Afghanistan, they think I have lots of money and all that. If I do, like I implemented the Spora project at the Danish Refugee Council, they funded a project, a water dam project. So it was voluntary from my side. So I implemented this project, and people had completely a different thought about this project. They thought that maybe I have got a lot of money and all that. So in one way, maybe it's not completely their fault because it's how it has worked. So they are used to it, and they think it's how it works. So they think maybe, so I take 50% of the project and I implement 50% of that, and maybe somehow we can negotiate and all that. Of course, they haven't talked to me directly, but it was my experience. And like the Danish Refugee Council, they're implementing diaspora called diaspora project. They work with Afghans, diaspora Afghans in Denmark. So in that way, they can be responsible for the fund they giving it to Afghanistan. So in that way, they can cross-check, and so if you go to Afghanistan and work with locals in Afghanistan, in that way, it's much easier for me as an Afghan, since I can speak the local languages and I know like who are these people. So if a completely foreigner who have no experience and cannot speak the languages, they can blindly trust people, because people are really good in making you to trust them. So in that way, I mean, if you involve Afghans who have lived outside of Afghanistan and who has experience, and if you make them to be accountable for the projects you're giving this Afghan Danish or Afghan Swedish, in that way, it's much more beneficial for locals and also for the government in Denmark. So it's beneficial for all stakeholders. And yeah, like the projects go to the right people, and not how it has worked in other kind of the other approach they have used. So yeah.
I would just add to that in the Northern European countries, there's a bit more control, and they're smaller countries. They're easier to keep track of the funds that go places. In the past, the American funding side has been so enormous and so poorly moderated and so poorly overseen that definitely use people and their expertise and their connections to the community to check things. But if you're not willing to personally go there yourself and oversee things, don't start, don't raise. If you're a great fundraiser, partner with somebody who's willing to go to the country, because everybody wants to be the savior of Afghanistan from our office in America. And the Afghans who have been making enormous profits without much results for the last 20 years are rubbing their hands in glee that you're getting ready to start pumping money through the pipeline again. So you got to be willing to go there and oversee it with your own eyes, and have a sense of control, and Big Brother is watching kind of. Otherwise, find local organizations to help. There's a lot of people trying to do good work that are not great fundraisers. People who are excellent operators are generally not very good fundraisers. So why don't we find a place for these two to come together, so that the people who are willing to do the work on the ground and who are good at it and who have got the cultural immersion, who speak the language, who have found connections like Gul on the ground, we've lived together, we work together, find a way to support them, because they're already there. It takes a long time of immersion to make your mistakes and to learn who to trust and who not to trust. And you can't do that in a few months or a few weeks. It takes years. So if you're not willing to devote that, don't open this can of worms. Be someone who supports activities in country. Don't be the new trying to make a name for yourself with a new organization and a new footprint. Everyone who started doing that 6 months ago, now they're all in Ukraine. So, which is great, Ukrainians need help, but don't start your organization to be the savior of Afghanistan and then shift your focus 4 months later. It's raises expectations and ends up doing more damage than good.
Jill, may I ask you a question on that note? And it's a little bit more law specific. And I know we're getting low on the time, so I'll turn over to Andrea after this. Are there particular local law considerations that organizations should keep in mind when operating in Afghanistan, when negotiating and/or renewing contracts?
Yeah, I'll say somewhat ironically, the functioning of the courts and the functioning of law enforcement is better now. And that's difficult to say, and people will disagree. I had a business partner who owed me quite a bit of money for non-payment of a contract. I found out last week, he'd done this to several people. I found out last week that Taliban seized his home, sold it, and used the proceeds to pay off the people he owes money to. So I tried to do that through the court system myself, and without bribing various people, it was not going to be possible, and I don't do that. But now things are in place. So the games that used to fly, the games of making promises, signing contracts, not following through, getting some money and running away with it, those times are over. You know, the Taliban is taking those things seriously and they're not messing around. So as you go in there, all of these loose rules and loose adherence to contracts, I think one small positive of the Taliban being in charge is that time may be over, and it was time for it to be over.
I'd just like to say the Taliban, whether we like it or not, just from experience, are a lot more hard-lined, but they're a lot more staunch than the former government of Afghanistan. They don't mess about in all aspects, and you know that's what you're saying, Jill. They just don't mess about, and that you know, there's some people that are happy that situation is like it. You know, there's a lot less, you know, crime in Afghanistan based on that. Whether it's fear or not, that's a different matter.
May I ask one more question? And Andrea, if you want to assume the next several questions, what particular measures can be undertaken for organizations first to secure the security of their people on the ground? It's a security-based question, their safety and well-being. And what advice would you have for an organization that is starting a project in Afghanistan? So I'll throw those two questions out. And then, Andrew, if you're going to assume this, because I think we're going to run out of time soon. Thank you.
In terms of security on the ground, straight up security, I don't recommend people change very much. The Taliban is not necessarily the threat anymore. They are searching door to door, but in my experience in my offices, they're not destroying things or hurting people. I can't speak for everybody because obviously that has been a problem, but Daesh is still a factor. And some of these smaller insurgent groups are still a factor. So in terms of security, sort of business as usual with steel doors and taking care of your own personal security, not telling people where you're going, not sharing pictures on social media until long after you've left a place. You know, the standard security procedures are pretty good. In terms of not attracting the wrong attention from the Taliban, we don't have to agree with certain social restrictions that are new, but I would advise following them. Even before the Taliban took over, I was not required to wear a hijab, but I did for respect and to blend in. There's no point in arguing certain things with the Taliban. That's what diplomacy is for. That's what international actors are for. Keep your staff safe. You know, advise your women to come and go in hijabs and with face masks for COVID, just for the sake of not rubbing people the wrong way. Is it, right in terms of rights? Not really, but that's a philosophical discussion versus physical safety. I don't know if anybody else wants to add.
If not, I had a few questions. We only have a few more minutes left, but in the few minutes that we have, and I don't think we're going to get to all the questions that we had planned for today, but one question is, what questions would you recommend that a donor ask before contributing to an organization? And this is for anyone on the panel.
I would look for some red flags. And for me, that's looking at who are some of the people involved and what are their CVs. You know, I was director of this ministry, or I was the minister at this ministry. Sure, they have a lot of connections that you want. They probably can facilitate a lot of things, but can you guarantee that in the past or in the future, they've behaved ethically? And I think you cannot. I think the corruption in the government was so extensive that anybody with signatory privileges, anybody that was responsible for stamping documents, question that. Anybody who started off in government and now has a huge office in Virginia, question that. Anybody who started in the government and now they've got a huge NGO in Afghanistan, question that. You know, if people are saying they're with an NGO, but they're FaceTiming you from $120,000 car, question that. There's been a long history of people saying things and taking things at face value. I think I would rather work with lesser known people who I'm certain have integrity, and we'll build things up from there. We don't need to try to catapult ourselves into a larger financial bracket NGO wise, or a larger footprint NGO wise by using some of these connections. You have to question how they got where they got and what are their intentions for the future. There's a lot of ex-ministers, ex-government officials who are very excited about the World Bank and the UNDP starting to do contracting and starting to put interventions back into the field. And I think if they made money on it last time around, we should question that. Because at the end of the day, all of those investments and all of those interventions did not have the outcomes we wanted and did not have the impact we wanted. So do we want to do more of the same, or do we want to do better? I want to do better. I think a lot of people want to do better. So if you don't know enough about the place that you have to rely on those people, or ministers who say, I'm a minister and I've got great connections to the Taliban, I'm sorry, I have a problem with that, don't you? So start smaller, question things, and work with people you trust. If you're not experienced on the ground, try to find people who are and who don't fulfill those sort of questionable categories I mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Those are great questions. Brad, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, I in some ways, just to build on what Jill just said, it's not so much, there's no perfect set of questions. I think the issue is that people don't, companies, organizations often don't listen to the answers and sort of adjust to the answers. And as you know, as Jill, you know, and others mentioned earlier, you know, there's often a lot of interest to sort of just get going, and the questions in the due diligence process can be a bit more cursory than it should. So, you know, whatever the right questions are for your organization, for a donor to think about, both from where risks can be, where security issues might lie, et cetera. I think the biggest issue that I've seen is sort of, especially when I was also at a law firm, I'd sort of see the right questions, but then the approach to answers is not a realistic one, and more a matter of like, we're collecting answers, we're not responding to them. And I think it's important to ensure that you have a true adjustment, and, you know, to Jill's point earlier, like take your time and go slow, and ensure that you're truly comfortable with what you've heard in response.
Thank you, Brad. That's very helpful to keep the broader purpose of the diligence in mind as you're doing it, not lose sight of the end goal. I wish we could go on for longer, but we're at the 1:30 mark. Thank you so much to all of you for
just one thing, Andrea. I wanted to thank you for organizing this panel. It was an extraordinary panel, and it's a great. I think it's going to be a lot of credit to the ABA. Many kudos, Andrea. Now, please, in conclusion, you did an extraordinary job. And it's a pleasure and honor to know you and serve with you with the Export Controls Committee and the ABA as well.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's very kind. And I'm glad that we could all find time today to talk about Afghanistan, because there's a very real an urgent humanitarian crisis going on there. So I hope that we continue to keep the focus on what is going on there and how we can help. And I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to participate. I'm so honored that you could all be part of this panel, and I greatly appreciate your contributions. And again, just another thank you to the ABA for helping make this program a reality.
Yes, many thanks. And also Jill, for you for taking out of time and connecting on LinkedIn and your incredible insights. So people have an idea of what to look for on the ground, not just a theoretical perspective.
Thank you for having
Very
me.
much value added.
Great panel.
Thank
As
you.
well as John, raising you as well, John. Always a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, take care.
Take
Bye-bye.
care,
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.